This is Toledo Symphony Lab, a behind-the-scenes look at the world of classical music from WGTE Public Media and your Toledo Symphony. I'm Brad Cresswell. Joining me today in the studio are the Toledo Symphony's president and CEO, Zach Vassar. We also have the principal, second violin, and artistic administrator, Merwin Sue, as well as the TSO's director of marketing, Vanessa Gardner. And we have a very special guest on the phone with us today. That is the wonderful composer, Kareem Roustom. Welcome, Kareem.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
You're on phone with us from the Boston area. That's correct?
That's correct.
Yeah. Well, the reason that we're talking with you today is because your music is featured in this concert. It's called Epic Journeys, happening Friday. That is November 5th at 8 o'clock p.m. at the Toledo Museum of Art Peristyle. This features this fascinating clarinet concerto that you wrote for the clarinetist Kinan Azmeh. And the concert is going to be conducted by Vinay Parameshwaran, who we've had on this show before, actually. He's worked with the TSO before. So why don't we start out, Kareem, because this episode is going to be all about you. You know, it's not often we get an actual living composer here on the program, so we're going to take advantage of that right now. Why don't you start, Kareem, by giving us a little bit of background on you, born in Syria, a Syrian-born American composer is what I'm reading, right?
That's correct, yeah.
Okay.
Well, I was born in Damascus a long time ago. I won't say how long. And my mother's American. My father's was a Syrian surgeon. They had 6 of us. And at some point, my mom decided that it was time to move back to the U.S. And I was about 13 at that time, so I moved here for 7th grade. And it was during that time that I discovered music. And it's been a long and fascinating journey since then.
Yeah. Well, did you play music as a youngster? Or how did you get? What was your gateway into music? Was it always composing and writing music, or were you an instrumentalist, a performer?
No, I've been self-taught all the way through. I began by teaching myself to play guitar. Very quickly, I was drawn to jazz, just the beautiful and complex harmonies in that world. And part of that tradition is improvisation. And so it feels like you're always composing. But at a certain point, I began to want to go back and explore the music of the Arab world, of Syria. And that's when I transitioned to focusing on that music and performing it on the oud, studying it, learning about it, teaching it as well. And so that long productive period was really, I think, formative in helping me find a voice that's somewhere in between these two worlds.
Well, for people who don't necessarily know what an ode is, can you give them a little rundown?
Sure. Yeah, so the oud is a short neck, fretless lute, and if you look at it, it looks like it's a pear that's been sliced in half. And it's really the predecessor of the European lute, which eventually becomes the guitar. Even the word lute comes from the word oud. When the Arabs brought this instrument with them to Spain, the locals began referring to it as laoud, which became lauta, and which became lute. So there's a long and very rich tradition of instruments and words crossing borders.
Yeah, that's interesting. I didn't know that about the etymology of that word. Now, you as a composer, you've worked with everybody from the Kronos Quartet to, pop icons like Shakira and Beyonce. Your music is out there performed by the great orchestras and ensembles of the world. You've also done work in film scores. There was an Emmy nomination for that as well. I've seen you profiled as a musically bilingual composer. I love that phrase. You told us a little bit about, your background getting into music, but since then, you've developed quite a singular voice. Can you talk about what it is that how your creations can sort of overlap all these different genres? How would you characterize your music?
That's a very hard question to answer. I can't really put it in words. But all I say, all I could try to explain is that, if you grow up in a certain way, if you have this kind of hyphenated existence, if you will, and you're interested in these worlds, then somehow you might find a way to bring them together. I was lucky that I was born where I was born. I was lucky to have the parents that I did. But it just takes a certain amount of effort, and mostly it just takes a certain amount of curiosity, I think, to try to find a common thread between the two, but to also recognize the differences and just to be able to feel comfortable in one language as well as the other.
Merwin provided some of these questions that I wanted to ask you today, so I'm going to turn it over to him and not steal his thunder, because I know that he's got some stuff he wants to talk about.
Well, I remember the very first time that I was introduced to your music. It was actually when we performed with the International Arab Orchestra, and
that's right.
And it was a concert Mid-East by Midwest, and the chance to actually work with a Tacht and then be behind them as a chamber orchestra was a very literal, physical depiction of this kind of one ensemble with different instruments, and how we're able to bridge those gaps. So I was just absolutely fascinated to hear that piece, and it was something that it was very timely, and it was something that has stuck with me to this day. So I just wanted to thank you for providing that opportunity, and I think we're fascinated to hear the clarinet now as a solo feature.
I think it's safe to say that you're a fan, right?
I absolutely am. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that's great. Now, I was not familiar with this clarinet concerto before I knew I was going to be talking to you, Kareem, and I thought, well, I better go listen to the thing. And it is really fascinating, the colors that you managed to evoke, not just in the orchestra, but in the clarinet, are so strongly tied to the literary provenance of the work. You have sort of a dual literary inspiration behind this piece. This is a clarinet concerto which is called Adrift on the Wine-Dark Sea. And when I first read that, I thought, I know Wine-Dark Sea, where have I heard that? And I figured out it was Homer's Odyssey. But you also are inspired by a novel that has to do with the Syrian Refugee Crisis. I wonder if you can first talk about the literary inspiration behind this work, and then I want to listen to and talk about the music.
Sure, absolutely. Well, Kinan Azmeh, I'm a great fan of Kinan. He's just a fabulous musician and a good friend. I didn't know him growing up in Syria, but when we met here in the U.S., I felt like I was reconnecting with a childhood friend. So that's a really, I think, big part of this piece, is who it was written for. And at the time of the writing, I think around 2017 or so, I had come across a book by Melissa Fleming called "A Hope More Powerful Than the Sea," which detailed the really incredibly difficult and horrific journey of a young woman named Doa al-Zamil, who was a Syrian refugee, and she and her fiancé at the time tried to cross the Mediterranean to get to Greece, and I believe they left from Egypt. Their ship was rammed on purpose, it seemed, and many people drowned. And somehow this young woman who was very petite, didn't know how to swim. All she had with her was one of those child's inflatable donuts, I guess you might call them, those little rings that you float in a swimming pool. And somehow she survived for over 2 days at sea. And the book is incredibly powerful, incredibly moving, and it put a very human and personal light on the types of journeys, these incredibly risky journeys that migrants take, refugees really, from one place to another. And so that story really made a very powerful impression on me. But it also reminded me of course, Homer's The Odyssey. And it was hard not to think about Odysseus and trying his journey home and the difficulties he maintained there. And in a way, I felt that Doha al-Zamil's journey was so incredible that it could have been Greek mythology. So in my mind, the literary connections between this very real book and this mythical story of Odysseus somehow just blended together to give me a sense of what this piece might be like.
When you're writing a piece like this, and I've read some of your notes about it where you say that different voices are represented by different instruments and the sea represented by the orchestra, how do you turn it into music? You're starting with a literary idea. What kind of ideas were coming to you early on when you started to write this concerto?
I think the first thing is to try to hone in on a feeling that you have, whether it's reading a poem, whether it's this literary connection. I try to begin to think about just this general feeling, and then I may sit down at the piano and just find the first couple of notes. And I think for a composer, these are our tools. These very basic, intervals from one note to the next, and you have to feel a certain amount of emotion from these very, very basic tools. And from there, it's a matter of kind of using your craft and your technique to take those basic emotions and take these basic themes or melodies, and then just kind of weave them into something much, much larger. But I believe it all begins with a feeling.
Yeah. I want to listen to the beginning of this clarinet concerto because it almost sounds like the waves lapping on the shore.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The way I wanted to begin it and end it was for this lone person standing on one shore and just confronting the sea. And in a way, that's how it begins, and the ending is somewhat similar. So it's just the clarinet, and I asked the percussionist to use a frame drum called an ocean drum, which is filled with beans or something, and as it rolls it gives a waving sound as well. So it's just this very lonely and kind of awe-inspiring moment at the beginning.
Yeah. I mean, the clarinet is going through these snippets of melody and these etudes, for lack of a better word, but there's also a real sense of anticipation going on here that I hear in the music, right?
Yes, absolutely. Preparing to go on a journey, something that's just much, much bigger than any one person.
Yeah. When you were writing this piece and you had this clarinetist in mind, I take it, Kinan Azmeh, did you talk with him about creating the work, or did you consult with him, or are you a clarinetist? I'm just curious how that would work.
I'm not a clarinetist, and so I did consult with him, and I remember sending him sketches back and forth, and getting some feedback here and there. So the mind of a soloist is a very interesting thing because you want to write something that's playable and gratifying to play. But you worry that if you write something that's too technically difficult, that they'll still say, yes, that's okay, send it. I can do it. So, and then in the end, when the piece is done, they're like, oh, maybe this is a little too hard.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm just letting it play out a little bit because I wanted to hear some of what the orchestra is doing and the way that the orchestra kind of unfolds with the clarinet and then takes on its own life. Can you talk about the role of the orchestra in this work?
Absolutely. The orchestra is often menacing. It's. I think it really very much plays the role of the sea, but an uninviting sea. But it's also, I suppose, the condition. It plays the role of the condition that forced somebody like Dua al-Zamil to make the journey that she did. It's the war that had spread out. It's whatever dire circumstances that forces people to leave their homes. And I think most people forget is that people would prefer not to leave their homes, and it's circumstances that push them to take these incredible risks. So the orchestra has all of these things in it. At times, it is being literal about being the waves. At times, it's more of a poetic interpretation of the waves. So it goes in between this mimicking of ocean, and then more of this kind of esoteric just representation of the emotions.
Yeah. It's interesting. It's on this concert that is paired with a couple of other pieces. And when I listen to Adrift on the Wine Dark Sea, it conjures up images of everything from like La Mer of Debussy to one of the works that is on this concert, Scheherazade of Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov. There's this sort of mythical storytelling quality to it. Do you find any resonance in that idea in putting these pieces together?
Absolutely. I mean, there's I think a long tradition of composers being inspired by the sea. Of course, La Mer, Elgar's sea songs. There are, and I also think about Britten and how he painted water in Death in Venice, and for him the water and the waves and the flow of the canals was a big there was a kind of a big motif there. So I feel that in a way this is part of that tradition of composers being inspired by the sea, and I think but as you say, there's also a storytelling tradition as well, and so in that sense I feel a connection to Scheherazade as well.
Yeah, well, the storytelling, of course, involving, as we said, the Iliad, or the Odyssey rather, by Homer, as well as this novel about the Syrian refugee crisis. Obviously, you have strong feelings about the Civil War and the resulting crisis. Has that affected many pieces of art that you've created, of music that you've created, or is this sort of the centerpiece of your reaction to that situation? It has. I mean, really, since 2011, most of the pieces that I wrote had reflected on that catastrophe that is the Syrian civil war and just the wider instability in the Middle East. So it has been a source of real sadness, real grief, disappointment, and so that has reflected in a lot of the music that I wrote since then. Obviously not everything, but I think that did influence a lot of what I thought about as I was writing, sometimes in very subtle ways and sometimes in very overt ways. When you're creating a piece of music that is related to contemporary or ongoing events or inspired by that, what do you think is the role of the music that you're creating? Is it to raise awareness? Is it to offer some kind of perhaps solution, or at least point people in the right direction, taking a political stance, as it were? I mean, how do you view the role of your music in terms of contemporary society?
I think politics change, right? They're constantly moving one direction or the other, but I think the human experience is constant, because we look at Homer's novel, however much of it is truth, however much of it is myth, and a mix of the two. This is hundreds of years old, but you see very similar things in Melissa Fleming's book, and so I feel that there's a thread of continuity to the human experience that I think is more important than the politics du jour, and so I try to tap into that. I try to write from an emotional place, hoping that I'll reach an emotional place in the listener, and the performers as well. I think I spend a lot of time thinking about the performers, trying to write a piece that I think they would be challenged by, but hopefully enjoy playing, and that it would be meaningful. Because if it's meaningful for them, then I think it really comes out in the performance. So ultimately, I don't think I'm trying to make a political message. If anything, it's a humanistic message in a piece like this.
Yeah. Zach, you want to jump in?
Yeah, first of all, I'm so happy to be having this conversation. I feel like there are moments when I want to be a fly on the wall and hear these sorts of impressions and ambitions, and I'm just so happy to participate in this. So thank you, Kareem. One of the things about the clarinet concerto that impressed me, you alluded to it earlier, is that it ends as very much as it began. It's kind of a bookend on the other shore, I presume. But there's still that sense that you referred to earlier of anticipation. And, you think about being lost at sea, the other shore is going to be your triumphant arrival. What is the anticipation on the other side in this, as you talk about the experience for the listeners and for the musicians and the emotional experience? What is that emotional experience at the end of this concerto?
I think, that's a good question. I think that musically and so I suppose dramatically, there's a little bit of a release, because it ends again. We hear the sounds of the waves, but in a different way, and then again the solo clarinet, and the way I ended the piece. Whenever I have to write a big piece and I want to use some different percussion, I go and visit a percussionist friend of mine here in Boston, a wonderful percussionist named Bob Schultz. And
I know Bob.
You know Bob?
Yeah, Bob and I have played together a lot. Yeah.
Okay, great. So he's a terrific musician, and he's got all of his percussion instruments in his basement, and we go down there and just bang on things and try different things. And before I wrote this piece, I said, look, I'm trying to find a way to depict the sound of a boat that's been tied to a dock, and the waves are gently kind of pushing it, and you get that little kind of kunk, 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 in a calm sea. And, he thought about this, and he went to his kitchen and came down with 2 wooden bowls. He filled the sink in his basement, and overturned the bowls and took out some mallets and started, gently tapping on them, and that was it. That was the sound, and I thought this was perfect. Yeah. And so the piece ends with that. It ends as if the refugee / Odysseus has arrived to the other shore, and the boat has been safely tied to the dock. But there's still this sense of anticipation that the journey is not over. If you remember when Odysseus does make it back to Ithaca, there are still difficulties ahead of him, and likewise for a lot of these refugees who made the journey across the Mediterranean, they had to walk from Greece to Germany. And I remember meeting a young violinist when I was in London. He was taking lessons at the Royal Academy, and he told me his story about how he took this incredibly dangerous boat ride and then walked from Greece to Germany, and running away from police and security and sleeping outdoors, and these just incredible stories. Yeah. So the piece resolves. It ends because it has to end, but there is that same sense of anticipation at the end that I think we feel at the beginning.
Yeah.
I thought it was just a magical effect, and thank you for telling me about the overturned bowls. That makes me so happy. It's like I know that the
I've never
Well,
been in
we're on
Bob's
that-
basement, but I can totally
Yeah.
picture it.
I was just, that was my next question. Have you been down in Bob's basement?
no, I
You have
have
not.
that's for the After Hours podcast. Yeah.
But you could maybe tell him hello for me if you think of it next time you see him.
Yeah.
I will.
Vanessa Gardner is the name.
He'll
And-
just know from Vanessa.
You know, that kind of opens up something completely unrelated. Kareem, you've worked with people who are from the pop world, like Shakira and Beyonce and what have you. You got any scoop you can share with us on those interactions?
What scoop? They were these crazy jobs that just opportunities that came up. And with the Shakira project, somebody from a management company called somebody, and they called me, and they were looking for somebody to arrange strings in the Arabic style.
Cool.
I put together a small band of traditional musicians, and when we were flown down to Nassau, where she lives. And so we worked in her home. She likes to start working around midnight or something like that, or 10 p.m. So it was a late night kind of a thing. She was very nice, but also I think, an incredible musician. I couldn't believe the airs she had on her, the details that she listened for, the things that she picked up on. And also very curious and very smart person as well. And we talked about the history of the Middle East over dinner. And she asked for books about the history, and which I shared with her. So I think what she is just a real craftsperson, and her world is that particular world. So that was my impression of it. Do I have any juicy stories? Not really.
Well, that was kind of juicy. That was like the classical music version of juicy. Right? I went and worked with her, and she was surprisingly knowledgeable and a great musician. That's kind of juicy. It's good to know, and to have a little backstage glimpse, of that sort of thing.
Well, I'm just so excited because I've now achieved everything I've ever wanted in my life. I'm now 1 degree of separation from Shakira.
Yeah, exactly. Now let me ask you, Kareem, because you've written music for film as well, and there's a very cinematic element to this clarinet concerto we've been talking about. Is that kind of a thing for you? I mean, do you write mostly program type music, or have you done strictly concrete type music?
I don't know that I always write programmatic type music. I think some pieces lend themselves to that. A lot of pieces don't. My 2 violin concertos are not at all programmatic, but there's maybe very strong emotions behind them, or in some cases a lived experience that help to sort of plant a seed for what the piece might turn into. As far as film music, most of the films that I've scored have been either independent film or documentary films, and so in none of those films I ever had a big enough budget to write for orchestra. So I always find it surprising when people make the connection, because if they listen to the music I wrote for these documentaries, it sounds nothing like my orchestral music. I suppose if there is a cinematic quality to it, it's not really intentional, but perhaps maybe because there's usually a strong storytelling thread in what I try to do. Perhaps that comes through.
Yeah. Well, part of the magic of the clarinet concerto, for instance, is, and especially if folks who listen to this podcast or read about it and they know what's going on with the inspiration, the literary inspiration behind this work, it really evokes a lot of images in your mind as you listen to it, and that has to be different for everybody, I assume. But that's what I'm talking about, the cinematic element, because there's this sort of like movie going on in your head. And a piece like Scheherazade came out, when those big orchestral tone poems, they were the movies, we didn't have it back then in the 1880s or 90s or whenever it was.
But also very cinematic.
Yeah.
If we were to use that adjective, I think it totally works, especially with the opening.
Yeah, there's definitely a connection there. Merwin, I know that you're over there drawing your little pictures and stuff, waiting patiently to get on mic. But you want to jump in here?
Yeah, it was one thing that I've always been fascinated by with the idea of a concerto is, I've been fortunate enough to, stand in front of an orchestra a couple of times. And there's this fundamental unfairness about it. I mean, Vanessa plays the horn, so maybe it's a little more fair for her. But if you're standing as a violinist in front of an orchestra, there's this fundamental unfairness about it that the composer works to mitigate. And it's always fascinating to see how they mitigate this. But in a way, I think because of the narratives that you were working with, I've never, in a way, felt a composer almost lean into the unfairness of it's not just an individual versus an orchestra. This is a protagonist versus the sea. And so for me, I've never really been so overwhelmed by the difference between an orchestra and the soloist as I have in this piece. And I think so that was something that fascinated me as I was listening to it.
When you say unfair, you mean unfair to all the other violinists, or unfair to you as a soloist?
Well, I think I think one of the things is, when you're talking about a protagonist such as either Dua El-Zanal or Odysseus, you're talking about somebody whose primary, one of the things that's being shown off is their resourcefulness. Yeah. And with the clarinet, you have an incredible amount of resources at your disposal. Yeah. But with an orchestra, that's, it's an unfair fight. Yeah. And I love watching. I love hearing that.
They have an unfair advantage. Did that thought occur to you while you were writing this piece, Kareem?
Absolutely. I mean, I think just what could be more overwhelming than the sea? I guess perhaps space. But also just kind of confronting it. I'm reminded. I mean, speaking of film music. There was a good friend of mine who pointed out to me that John Williams, whenever he wanted to paint the sort of overwhelming feeling of space, in these Star Wars movies, he'll often use a piccolo, and that such a small. We feel so small in front of this vast, almost unknowable thing, and so that is very much, I think, part of it. And there are times in the clarinet concerto when the orchestra swallows up the soloist, but then he kind of breaks through the waves again. So I tried to do that purposefully in some places, but there's the technical side of trying to get things balanced. It's always a little dicey. You never know what you're going to get. You can try to plan for these things, but I think overall I left enough space for Kinan to be heard throughout.
Yeah. Now I've got those John Williams piccolo riffs in my head.
Yeah, right.
From da da dee 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 dee, right? That sort of thing. All you Star Wars fans, you know what I'm talking about here.
Absolutely.
Kareem, you mentioned Kinan, the clarinetist Kinan Azmeh, and you've spoken a little bit about your collaboration with him. Can you dive into some more detail and just tell us about your work with him as an artist?
Yeah. So Kinan and I had some mutual friends at the time. Kinan was performing with the West Eastern Divan Orchestra. He was performing as a soloist with them, and they were traveling around the U.S. and they actually came to Brown University to perform in Providence, Rhode Island, and so I went there, and that was the first time I met him, and I want to say, my God, was this 2006? Something like that. And we just connected, and shortly after that, he said, "Look, I'm going back to Damascus to run this festival. Would you write me a piece for clarinet and string trio?" And so I did. And I went back to Damascus 2008, March of 2008, and we had a wonderful time. And it had been a long time since I'd been able to go to Damascus, and this was the first time that I was able to go back there for musical reasons, and to be there with Kinan, to see some family members, and to walk to my old school and see my old house that I grew up in. It was very emotional and wonderful, and I had hoped to go back more and volunteer at the conservatory there. But the civil war started in 2011, and unfortunately I've not been back to Damascus since 2008, and it's a very long time. But Kinan and I, continued to collaborate. I wrote more pieces for him. He played on one of my film scores. He played on an album project. And I feel in many ways that I'm still not done. I still think I have another piece in me for him. I'm thinking about something for clarinet and string orchestra. But we saw each other at one point. We met each other by accident at an airport in Berlin, and we had some time and sat down and had a sandwich and coffee. And so I haven't seen Kinan in a really long time, and so I'm excited to see him again when I come out in November.
Yeah. Kinan is playing this concert, the wonderful clarinet concerto, which I want to say the title again for folks who didn't hear it. It's called Adrift on the Wine-Dark Sea, music of Kareem Roustom. This is happening Friday at 8 o'clock p.m. at the Paris Style. More information at toledosymphony.com or 419-246-8000. We got some more questions from folks here in the studio. Vanessa, you have anything you want to...
Well, the question I was going to ask is about your experience in Damascus, and I was curious the last time you visited. It's interesting that it has been so long. What about your time there as a child, and how was that time different than post 2008, and what experiences from that time do you bring to your music?
I think that experience was incredibly important in shaping who I was. I think the first 13 years or so, or 16 years of our lives, really, maybe even the first 5 years, but really shape us. It was a very rich cultural existence. It was just a very sociable place to be, visiting family, friends, people would drop by, and so you were around people all the time, and that was a really beautiful time, but it was also a very difficult time because the regime that is currently there has been there since that time and before. And the reality of the brutality was always there. There were things that I saw firsthand, things that I experienced that were really traumatic and very, very difficult. Growing up in a police state. So it was this mix of this beautiful, wonderful experience with family and extended family, and the wonderful, amazing cuisine and the places to visit, but at the same time there was always this very dark undertone that often was something that was never spoken about, was always acknowledged. So those things really did shape me and do kind of shape my outlook about the world, and which eventually filters into my music as well.
When I was at the Boston Conservatory, I played in the production of Kismet, and there was a character in the musical, and I don't remember all of the plot details, but he had a very witty delivery of the line, "Get thee to Damascus." And it always made the pit orchestra crack up, but it always made me want to go to Damascus and just experience that. And it was a silly thing, but just the way he delivered it, it was very charming. Yeah. And there was a little bit of charm that I feel like that delivery put on Damascus.
Now I've got, A Stranger in Paradise in my head, which is really Borodin, but
Well, I hope you will get to Damascus someday, because it is an incredible city. It has changed a lot, but I think it would be a wonderful trip to make when the time is right.
Sure.
Yeah.
I always just love to ask, and if you don't care to share, that's perfectly fine. Just say pass. But Kareem, what are you working on now?
What am I working on now? A few things. I sent off not too long ago a piece, orchestral work for the Malmö Symphony in Sweden. Robert Trevino will be giving that premiere. And oddly, it's another piece about the sea, and it's another piece that in a very much looser way deals with the experience of refugees. Malmö is a city that has welcomed waves of refugees since World War II. And so when I spoke with the orchestra about that, they were very keen on having some element of that as well. So these are two big pieces that deal with journeys across the sea. And then I just finished a work for solo violin and string orchestra for a friend here in the area, and working on a short piano etude. But the next big thing is a 30-minute song cycle for mezzo-soprano and orchestra for the Grand Teton Festival Summer 23.
Oh, yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah, they've commissioned some wonderful works from various composers. It's great to hear that.
Can I actually ask about something? I'm not sure how recent this is, but I understand that you had also written an entirely different piece about the Odyssey.
Yes, that was a work, a collaboration with the conductorless, no offense, string orchestra here in Boston, A Far Cry.
They're a great group.
The Lorelei Ensemble, the women's chorus. And so they had approached me about setting some text from the new translation of the Odyssey. So we focused on the women of the Odyssey from this new translation. So that's a work called Hurry to the Light. And although Odysseus is there in the background, we never actually hear any text of his. So each of the movements highlights one of the women. We have Penelope, who comes in a few times, very prominent there, Circe, Odysseus' mother, and of course the sirens as well.
Yeah, that sounds like such an interesting project. Back to the clarinet concerto, which premiered in 2019, right? So that was pre-pandemic. I mean, then how did you spend the last couple of years as a composer under the pandemic?
Very busy. It was a difficult time. It still remains to be a challenging time emotionally, but I've not stopped writing. I wrote my second violin concerto for the Dallas Symphony, and their principal second violinist, Angie Fuller Hyde, and that was premiered in May after a few delays. So I was able to go to Dallas for that performance as well. So I just this past week I had the premiere of a choral work I wrote for the Peabody Institute for their wonderful choirs there, and so that was a piece with text from the Johns Hopkins Nursing Alumni magazine. When I was looking for text, I contacted their archives, and the archivist said, well, our Nursing Alumni magazine has just been digitized, and you may want to look at the November 1918 issue. And I found a beautiful text in memory of nurses who had passed away during the Spanish flu pandemic. So pieces along those lines. I've also been listening to and inspired by listening to Syrian Orthodox hymns, which I used to hear when I was young. So a few pieces in with that spirit, something very calming and grounding. I've been writing those as well, and that's something that I will continue to write as well. So I've been keeping pretty busy, actually.
Yeah. Well, such fascinating projects that you mentioned, and it's so nice of you to give us this extended time to talk about your music and your work and your life. Kareem Roustom is the composer of the clarinet concerto Adrift on the Wine Dark Sea, which is on the program with the Toledo Symphony Friday evening at 8 p.m. at the Toledo Museum of Art Paris style. The concert is called Epic Journeys. Kareem's music also heard on the program with Scheherazade of Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov and a piece called Mighty River by Errollyn Wallen. I don't know that piece. Is anybody here?
Sure. I think it really, I think the three pieces really explore the intersection between legend, history, and the present day. Errollyn's piece is about the transatlantic slave trade. She was born in Belize, but actually works in the United Kingdom. And the piece celebrates the 200th anniversary, I think, of an abolition act that was passed in the UK. And I thought it was really incredible to bring a piece about the slave trade, which, let's face it, when it's taught in American schools and American history, is treated as very much a British American problem. To bring something to this really an oceanic context to it, and then it all ties in with this a wonderful treatment of amazing. Oh shoot, my mind just. Amazing Grace.
You had one job.
This amazing treatment of Amazing Grace.
Yes.
My mind would not let me use that word twice in one sentence.
That's okay.
But that in itself is an extraordinarily transatlantic story because it's a British poet, a song called New Britain, but being united by an American composer. And all of this kind of tied together with this sense of an oceanic journey. I think all three of these pieces are just really thematically cogent, and it's just, I don't know, I'm getting shivers thinking about this concert. It means a lot to me.
I'm very excited to hear this program as well. I'm looking forward to it.
That's wonderful.
And Kareem, I'll just say out loud, I'm so thankful to you for your patience. I know this is a performance we had originally scheduled for last season, but this is the right time to do it. I'm very excited to have you here for it.
Well, thank you. Thank you for programming, and thank you for having me.
This program is a production of WGTE Public Media in collaboration with our sponsor, the Toledo Symphony, with generous support from the Rita Barber Kern Foundation. You can download episodes of our program as a podcast by going to our website at wgte.org/lab. You can also subscribe to us through your podcast app of choice, including Apple and Google Podcasts. Don't forget to check out all the upcoming events at the Symphony by visiting their website at toledosymphony.com and their various social media outlets on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. You can find the TSO's streaming platform online at stream.artstoledo.com. My thanks to Zach Vassar, Merwin Sue, Vanessa Gardner, and especially to our very special guest, composer Kareem Roustom. I'm Brad Cresswell. This has been Toledo Symphony Lab from FM 91.